Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Goldfeder, a principal at Earnscliffe Strategy Group, and the moderator for this first part of our two-part discussion on healthier buildings for a greener future, improving air quality in buildings post-COVID. The premise of this event, which is sponsored by Armstrong Fluid Technology, is that in meeting the dual challenges of ensuring healthier buildings and a mandate for reducing our carbon footprint, consideration must be given to how we circulate heat and cool air in our built environment. There's an opportunity in this moment as we balance those requirements to address aging infrastructure and building systems in a thoughtful and deliberate manner to make our buildings both more efficient and more productive in every way. So our first session today is Going Green, how technology can improve employee health and reduce emissions. And this brings together experts that combine an understanding of the technologies available, along with the state of our built environment, the requirements of the MUSH sector, specifically of universities and schools, and the potential that can be unlocked in those environments with considered investment in more efficient leading edge technologies. So our panelists are Tony Capito, Research Chair, Sustainability at IdeaWorks and Mohawk College in Hamilton, Ontario. Steve Kemp, a Principal and Senior Energy and Sustainability Specialist at RDH Consulting in Toronto. Marta Shantz, Senior Vice President, Urban Land Institute in Washington, D.C. And Peter Thompson, Director, Building Systems Solutions at Armstrong Fluid Technology in Toronto. Before turning to our panelists, I want to note that on your screen, you'll notice a Q&A button. We look forward to hearing from you. And would ask that you use that button to type any questions to the panelists, and I will address those as they come up in our discussion. I'll be monitoring that, and we're going to try and get to as many of your questions as we can in the time allowed, and we will take away what we cannot. So now, what I wanted to do is start with our panelists and hearing from each of them what they're thinking on this key premise. And I think I'm going to start with Steve Kemp. As you look at our cities and communities with an eye towards ensuring both the health and well-being of the individuals in our communities and the sustainability of the built environment, what catches your eye?
Well, I think the number one thing that catches my eye is that sort of taking on the lessons of new construction, we've done an awful good job, I think a reasonably good job of designing more efficient buildings. Our building codes are getting better. And the leadership in MUSH sector included in the marketplace has took up lead first, is now actually starting to look at passive house and net zero in their new construction. And many of the things we're being recommended reopening buildings are actually implemented already in LEED buildings, such as higher filtration and good humidity control and so on. But we can't build ourselves out of this problem of climate change and issues like this. We have to start looking at the existing building stock. That is where the bulk of our emissions are. And again, I think the MUSH sector can provide leadership here and start solving the hard problems so that can trickle down into the rest of the industry, just as it did with new construction.
Thank you. And Marta, I'll ask you to build on what Steve just kind of outlined, but also to consider the return on investment for deep retrofits that address both these concerns, healthier interior air and reduced carbon emissions. These retrofits can be daunting. And so how do we outline the ROI in such a way that makes the business case clear for moving ahead?
Absolutely. And that's one of the things we look at ULI is that business case for reducing carbon emissions and tying that to increased asset value. I mean, in the real estate community and really all building owners, there needs to be that financial case to take the action to that next level. And when we think about energy efficiency, the business case is very clear. You save energy, you save your utility costs, that translates directly to your operating expenses, net operating income, and asset value. There are very clear calculations there. The health side is much more challenging to quantify. You can think about productivity of occupants. You can think of less sick days, higher cognitive functioning. Those type of features are good, but very hard to quantify a dollar value associated there. And so when we think about energy efficiency and health, there are sometimes some challenges to make that business case, and we continue to strive and work on that. Granted, sometimes we think of energy efficiency as sometimes contradicting elements with health improvements. As Steve mentioned, increased ventilation and other initiatives to increase the health of a building sometimes require higher energy usage. And so taking that into account in the business case is also quite important.
So Peter, you're the expert on these technologies. And when a project manager or a potential client comes to you and says, I need to make my building work better, I need it to circulate this, do these dual competing things of circulating outside air more often, provide better filtration, and at the same time be more efficient, what do you say? How do you do that?
I think the terrific thing about this opportunity is, as just been mentioned, is there is an existing cash flow. There is existing energy cost. There is existing maintenance cost. There is existing operational costs. And what we've done with technology is integrated solutions that for new construction, they are the lowest life cycle cost plus the lowest first cost. And on a retrofit, we're able to give a smart roadmap that's going to help the built environment in terms of the health of the occupied space and pay for itself very quickly. So returns on investment, payback periods of 5 to 8 years, they're easily achievable with deep retrofits if done well. A big part of that is education, because there's so many stakeholders involved in the decision. It's hard to satisfy all the questions and have a fully informed stakeholder base. So for us, I think awareness and education is the biggest opportunity that we could get out of this, and incentives can play a large role in that. So that's sort of our perspective.
That's great. And I'm going to come back to you a little bit later and ask you some more detailed questions on some of the technologies and what they actually can deliver in some of these built environments. But first I want to go to Tony, and I've saved you for last because I want you to hear how this connects specifically with schools and universities. So what is it that makes them uniquely well suited or well prepared to demonstrate the benefits of these deep retrofits?
That's a great question, and I appreciate the lead in from the others. I think colleges and universities, by nature, have a responsibility to lead by example. So we are charged with educating anywhere from skilled trades to our professionals, engineers, architects, and others who are responsible for buildings and the ongoing operation of those. So, we have that, not only that responsibility of education and preparing these young students to take on buildings as they develop into their careers, but we're also examples of a systematic problem in the public sector where we have considerable amount of deferred maintenance. Easily in Ontario, just alone, between colleges and universities, we're speaking about billions of dollars worth of deferred maintenance that needs a considerable amount of retrofit and work in itself. So we need to lead by example by doing the things that are necessary to advance the cause towards lower carbon, lower energy. We're systematically doing that. Many of our colleagues are doing that, but we do need help, and we do need recognition and participation from a lot of our private sector partners as well.
So, I mean, it's clear that these improvements are exactly what we really need to move forward with in order to meet these dual goals. But I guess the other part of that question, and I'll kind of come to both Steve and Peter on this, although I'm sure both Marta and Tony have thoughts as well. What are the obstacles? What is it about the way that we think about funding and financing retrofits that are particular challenges in this environment? Are there challenges of time? Are there challenges of financing? When we look at the potential infrastructure that we're talking about, especially here in Canada at this moment, why should these particular projects rise to the top? So maybe if I could, I'll start with Peter, and then Steve, and then we can kind of catch up and see if anyone else has any thoughts.
I think when we talk about the deep retrofits, the perception is that there's a lot of engineering that has to go into each one of these projects, as opposed to maybe a lighting retrofit where you can get a canned solution that can easily accommodate maybe every environment, whether it's a high school or a public school or a university campus. That initiative could be taken on. There are similar approaches that can be used, in fact, in the HVAC system. with fluid flow and heat transfer that will benefit the comfort in the space, help regulate humidity better, help accommodate more fresh air, which is something that we're seeing now, especially as we return to work and school with the situation we faced in the last 6 months. And that's an opportunity. But the way to make that work in my mind is to make it simple. And what was simple about lighting retrofits was it was simple. I mean, there were one or two simple solutions that you could go, prescriptive roadmaps. With the deep retrofits, we need to take the same approach to make it simple. Either step 1, 2, 3, or take all 3 steps at once. So we need to understand what those options are. And we've worked on some of those projects and come up with some approaches with prefabricated technology or integrated intelligent devices. So that is our perspective, is really simplicity at the end of the day is how we have to approach it.
Excellent. And Steve?
I'll echo the simplicity. I always found that the simple design building has a far greater chance to operate as intended and achieve its actual energy targets that it was after. I love super insulated buildings for that reason, because everything gets simple after that. But I'll also echo sentiment we heard earlier, is that the bus sector does, I think, need to lead to find solutions, because with deep energy retrofits, we're going to be looking at some older mechanical systems that, we're not just replacing boilers and chillers anymore, and replacing fans with variable speed fans. We may have to look at the bones of the distribution system and how to get it to stop wasting energy, because some of these older systems were fundamentally designed to simultaneously heat and cool the building at the same time. And so some of these things had to be figured out, and solutions need to be, cost-effective solutions need to be come up with. How do you reuse what is there to achieve the new design paradigm you're aiming for with your HVAC system? And as those lessons are learned, they can be trickled down, and we can learn how to do it less expensively, simpler, and gain that experience for the rest of the market to take up.
And Marta, I'm wondering if you could speak to that, because I know that you've got, the Urban Land Institute has a lot of experience in looking at the whole range of these.
Oh, it looks like you muted yourself at the end of that question.
Oh, sorry, I was just handing it back over to you. Go ahead.
Okay. When it comes to financing and funding, there are a lot of different mechanisms that exist to go after those high upfront cost investments for those deep retrofits, right? A lighting retrofit is fantastic. It can have a 3-year payback and often be paid with capital funds that already exist within the operating budget sometimes. For those larger projects, whether it's installing solar panels or updating your fans with variable speed drives, those type of deeper systems, and especially big bundled retrofit projects with high upfront costs can be a real hurdle. So there's some different options out there, whether you go for a green loan, where sometimes a bank can offer a loan with better terms if they know that the money is going towards energy efficient or water efficient projects. There are also, and I think Tony might speak to this too, but energy service companies who work kind of like utilities do with on-bill financing, where this outside entity can pay the upfront costs of the improvement, and then you pay it back over time with the savings, which is a fantastic model. And in the States where I am, we have what's called property assessed clean energy loans, or PACE, which every country is different, but it's worth mentioning that it's a way to have an off the balance sheet loan, so that if a building isn't paid off yet and already has a mortgage to take care of, there's an off the balance sheet loan that's paid off with property taxes. And so there are a lot of different creative solutions to address that upfront cost for deep retrofits.
And Tony, I know that there's a lot of this discussion, especially within schools and universities.
There is. I think one advantage of climate change, and I'm raising that first, is it's forced many institutions to selecting targets. And when you try to look at what are the processes that are necessary to achieve those targets, it typically involves significant energy reduction. And as you take the deferred maintenance requirements that are there, what is necessary is a clearly articulated plan to get you towards these targets, and recognize that there are some short-term, but certainly some long-term requirements that will systematically get you there. So as mentioned earlier, there's different ways to go about that. One is to develop a localized plan and have your organization provide the necessary funding in addition to what the government's, particularly here in Ontario, where governments fund much of the retrofitting, to look at supplementing that to get the right mix in place. A criticism has been that, particularly here in Ontario, provincial governments have significantly underfunded the need for retrofits and energy reduction and everything else. Yet there are some organizations who have taken a bit of a leadership role to do this. Now, as Marta mentioned, I think there's other approaches to go about this, and that is recognition that most organizations have a significant potential for energy savings that are pent up and they haven't taken advantage of. And there's an opportunity to look at a longer term approach, 5, 10, 20 years, in the form of an energy performance contract where you can look at significant savings, anywhere from 20 to 30% is not uncommon, and look at that over the long term. Take the plan that you have and have the ability and the capacity to finance that properly over a period of time. It takes a lot of planning and coordination. I've undertaken several of those, and they can be successful, and they have a huge benefit and upside. There's also some technologies that are coming on board right now that are better than they were. Certainly LED lighting has been a game changer over the last few years. The cost is coming down, but there's also things like duct sealing technologies that are helping out right now. There's a considerable amount of savings that have a potential there with very quick return and payback. So it takes a leader within that organization to put something together. And with the expertise that's around the table here, there's opportunity for everyone.
Marta.
I could add two more quick innovations that we're seeing. One is called a revolving loan fund, where we're starting to see companies and organizations have a specific bucket where the savings from energy efficiency investments come into, so that as future projects are planned and invested in, they're able to pull from that same fund. So once a project has been funded, it just continues to revolve internally within the organization. So that revolving loan fund is something that we've seen pretty successful in some more innovative corporations. And then also we're seeing this concept called energy efficiency as a service. So not like software as a service, which we're all relatively familiar with these days, but energy efficiency as a service, almost like a rent to own model, where light bulbs will be installed and HVAC systems can be installed as well. And it's like as a service, so you pay over time as opposed to an upfront cost. And that's something that's pretty creative and just starting to see more play.
That's interesting. And I'm wondering if perhaps Steve or Peter also have anything. One of the things that Tony talked about being that energy performance contract, and I'm sure that those are things that both of you in your kind of day jobs have a lot of experience with, if you wanted to add anything on that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been seeing, especially in my market here in Toronto, there are both in new construction and in renovations, coming to hospitals, coming to municipalities and saying, you know, we will replace your boiler plant with our new low carbon plant. We're paying for it. You have it. We're just now going to be utility to you. And you'll get your savings, you know, you'll get your GHG savings over time. And of course they pay for the capital out of the reduced operating costs that the plant operator is now receiving. Because basically they're pocketing the difference on what their operating costs are versus what they're going to get paid for that energy.
We're seeing that trend worldwide, actually. A lot of pay-as-you-go type models and the transition to district energy. A lot of large cities around the world have found district energy very successful for cooling and heating as an approach for the community, because that's not really the core business of the purpose of the entities within the building. So it's sometimes difficult to be the expert at that technology and keeping it up to pace and optimal for energy efficiency and maintenance. So that's one comment that I would like to share with everyone, and we see that happening around the world. But something else is the ability today, unlike 15, 20 years ago when there were a lot of energy savings companies throughout Canada and the US and around the world, was the ability to track and be transparent with the results that were being achieved and allocate the impact specifically to the the measures that were put into place. I think today the cost of doing that metering and having intelligent products that can report out how much energy they're actually consuming and what they're outputting is a big step forward for the world. So there's not as much risk as what we had back in the 80s and 90s and beginning of this century. But those energy savings companies have a much more transparent ability with the technologies and the cost of them today.
And just to remind the audience that we do have the Q&A box, and we got a question, and I think it was kind of stemmed off of some of the stuff that you were just discussing, Peter, asking about the role of of connectivity and transparency of information, and how that plays into these deep retrofits. And you spoke a little bit to that, but I would ask the rest of you as well, you know, what we're kind of moving from a model where, you know, machines were installed in buildings, and then, you know, if there anything needed to happen to those, it was basically mechanical repairs, to now our buildings are requiring constant updates, much like our phones and our laptops. And so how does that play into kind of this ability to see what's happening in your building in real time, and how does that then affect the desirability of these deep retrofits? So Peter, I'll give you a chance to kind of finish up on that, and then I'd ask the rest of the group to chime in.
But the older systems that were designed, that we've inherited in our buildings today, were very simple to run. They were set point operated systems as opposed to performance-based systems. And as we get into performance-based systems, the expectation is there for performance. It's not just that the room is warmer or comfortable or cool, but that we're also performing well in terms of our maintenance costs and our energy costs. So this transparency through the connected world, a lot of devices today are becoming smart devices that have IP addresses and can report out their operations and their performance and do that assessment on their own in the cloud to make it simple for the operators. And that's where the simplicity comes in, because if an operator is uncomfortable, doesn't know that it's working well, they may put it back into manual mode and work back to where we started from. So this making people comfortable, making them informed, helps with that comfort level and gives them the transparency that they need, that they're on track to achieve the goals that they wanted to get.
I can jump in on that. As Peter mentioned, you know, technology has helped with reducing risk, and metering and sub-metering have come a long way. They still have a long way to go, but they're better. And we also, in organizations like ourselves, have dashboards. We have occupants and namely students who can see real-time results and be the ones who are poking at us saying, hey, this thing's not working the way it should, or we're seeing this particular trend or not. And that's a healthy thing. I think that's something that I've always been a strong advocate for, is to have occupants of buildings better understand their environment. There's many people who work in buildings who just put up with things that do not contribute to their wellness or a healthy environment or otherwise. So the more people are informed because of better technology, the better I think facilities individuals will have to maintain systems. And that's a good thing. And it will become even better as time goes on, where artificial intelligence will look at a lot of different pieces and components of this and fix themselves in many ways. But the more individuals and occupants are informed, the better it is for the environment and their wellness.
And not only are they more informed, they're also more likely to buy into the technology, right? If there are new daylighting sensors installed to not only help with the health and wellness of a space, but also to help the lighting efficiency. If the occupants of the space don't understand how they work or just don't like them, they'll cover up the sensors and make them obsolete. So that the long-term success of these new technologies are critical to have that occupant buy-in, whether it's students or office tenants or multifamily apartment dwellers. Everyone needs to be bought into these technologies to ensure their long-term success. And so having that transparency of data, understanding why these sensors are important, what the benefits are, not only for them on the health and wellness side, but also for the building on the energy efficiency side, it all goes hand in hand.
Yeah, I've had the good fortune to actually live and work in some of these super efficient buildings, and when everyone's on board and understands what it is, and we do the post-occupancy surveys, everyone's raves about how they love their space. maybe that's a knock-on effect. Maybe it's not, maybe it's something you say because I think I should be saying it and I should be getting all these benefits, but it seems to be a consistent theme that we've seen in post-occupancy surveys of really well-designed, energy efficient, good health and quality buildings. And also back to metrics, I've been thrilled with the ability of the marketplace to start understanding energy use intensity, and people are throwing around kBTUs per square foot and understanding that in the context of their buildings. I think we can throw a few more at them, because that peer pressure of comparing yourself to the others. So, publishing your installed lighting power density, publishing your kilowatts per CFM for fan power and for pumping power. These are, simple design metrics that don't need a meter on them, but if you start understanding the context of your peer group of buildings, why are they way down there and I'm way up here? What am I doing wrong and what are they doing right? And how do we investigate that? And it gets those conversations going.
And we're starting to get some more questions in, and one of the ones that I'd like to address, because I think there's two sides to this. So the questioner asks about the obstacles and friction points to getting to deep retrofits, but I'd also ask if the group of you could come up with some thoughts on how to resolve those obstacles and friction points, and what levers might be what might be able to be used. If I could start with you, Marta.
Absolutely. So there are a couple of different obstacles to deep retrofits. I'd say the first is just information. A lot of folks don't necessarily have the educational information to know what technologies are available, how much they'll benefit them, how fast of a payback sometimes truly do exist on these projects. And so not knowing, you don't know what you don't know. And that is one challenge in the built environment, where folks just don't even know that they should go after these deep retrofits. The second side of things is financing. Absolutely, making sure you have the funds to invest in these big projects. And one way to go about that, which I'm a big fan of, is bundling projects, where if you know that a lighting retrofit is going to have a fantastic payback period, maybe you bundle that with an air handling unit upgrade, which likely has a longer payback period, but has a deeper savings potential, so that when you marry the two calculations, you have a much more compelling financial case for the project. So we've seen some success there. On the information side, I'd say reaching out to local industry groups is something, but also relying on your consultants who do this all the time is quite useful. So I would say those are two of the biggest ones, just financing and information.
And that kind of tosses back over to you, Steve, I think, in kind of talking about what some of the levers you might be able to use. I also just want to build on this, because there's another question that came in that asks about additional market and decision challenges that you all could highlight for us on when companies are looking for, when institutions or when government is looking to make these kind of big decisions on deep retrofits. So Steve, if I could go to you and then to Tony and then back over to Peter.
Yeah, I guess my impression of existing buildings is most building operators are spending all their time fighting fires and are seldom given the time to sit down and go, we need to look at this more holistically. And what is the big thing? Certainly there's a question online here about lighting retrofits versus HVAC retrofits. Certainly lighting is almost always low-hanging fruit. If you don't have LED lights and appropriate light levels yet, yeah, it's really straightforward. It's really easy. But at some point you have to look at the design holistically, and you can't line item things out on a long payback, because it starts working as a whole, and that may be expensive thing that you save, capital cost savings over here. And so the deep retrofits that are likely needed for some of these buildings do need someone to sit back in the existing building and go, okay, we got to start looking at this holistically. Let's start thinking about a feasibility study. There are now funds coming for feasibility studies by different government organizations to fund feasibility studies, and start looking at the whole building more holistically, and what can we do and what can we go for.
Tony.
There's some excellent points here, but I always look back now over the last few years and how the most senior levels of governance in organizations have come to the fold and understand what it means to have reduced their risk. So you take, I'm at a college and I've worked at university as well. I've always found in recent years that good members of the board recognize the challenges with deferred maintenance and problems with their facilities, and that they need to take action to either reduce that risk or put themselves in a better position to recruit students and faculty and staff. And I'm bringing this point up, and it's certainly happened in Mohawk. I'm very proud of that, of what's happened in that way. But one of the challenges that we've experienced in the last 3 months, particularly here in Ontario, and I'm sure there's, it's in other provinces as well as across the states, with our senior centers and our long-term care centers. One of the biggest challenges, not only with the administrative pieces that go with the problems with the virus and everything else, many of the infrastructure issues with those buildings were decrepit. They have old systems that haven't been properly maintained, haven't been upgraded. There's really no risk aversion issues that have happened. They're a mess. And when you layer that with a challenge, a health challenge that we've had everywhere for 3 months or so, it really raises these issues that we're talking about the importance of having a well-tuned, highly technical facility that works properly and provides the level of health and wellness that occupants deserve. And we're seeing that. And I think there'll be a lot of changes everywhere as time moves forward in the next little while.
And then I think, yeah, Peter, if you have any thoughts to wrap up on this.
I would like to talk a little bit about the friction point. We talked about the ability of getting finance and the payback and the ROI, and documenting the savings and having that credited towards the investment. But at the same time, our industry historically, and it still exists sometimes today, we like to bulk up. We like to put safety factors in, and then the next player in the game adds a safety factor. And that's been our approach, and for good reason, because of maintenance issues and challenges. We want people to remain comfortable. But today, with the technologies that are available in designing new buildings, we can be a little bit more closer to what we really think the true requirement is. And if we use that old replace like for like approach on some of these facilities that were really bulked up, too much capacity, perhaps in a boiler plant or chiller plant or air handler system, and not take into account that we could reduce some of those capacities and still get by and have good, comfortable spaces, we're just escalating the upfront price. And that not only goes for the general approach, but also the new technologies. We've worked on projects with heat pumps using geothermal bore wells for heat rejection, a very efficient system as opposed to boilers. And also we've worked with solar thermal. And on those projects, starting as late as 9 years ago and moving forward, we still are a little bit on bulking up side. So much so on the first projects that we didn't have a method to dissipate enough heat from the solar thermal installation. So the ROI on those projects could be spectacular if we begin to design and right size for the requirements. And there's a little bit of envelope discussion in there that I truly appreciate. We need to improve some of our envelopes, and then we can even improve the upfront investment costs for those sustainable solar thermal and geothermal heat pumps. And that's how we'll get the payback periods down. That's how we can integrate technology. And if we want a safety belt, if we want to wear belts and suspenders at the same time, we can leave an access port for an emergency standby boiler to be hooked up if there is a problem with the site. So there's approaches in our industry to get over some of the fear around the numbers and some of the fear around the performance of what's going to be delivered by these new technologies. So I think it's...
Yeah, I just wanted to echo strong support for that concept of right sizing equipment, especially when you think about all of the other energy efficiency improvements that are going on for a deep energy retrofit that's more than just one building system. It's generally quite a comprehensive type of project. If you're upgrading your rooftop unit, for example, but you've already improved your lighting to have LEDs and sensors, and you've maybe even put in new windows for a tighter envelope, you don't need nearly the same amount of heating and cooling if your lights are no longer heating your space, and if your system just doesn't need that much ventilation anymore. And so this idea of making sure that you don't just replace like for like in these instances, and very much right size based on the need of the space, is critical. It ties in really nicely as well to the concept of healthy buildings, right? Because healthy buildings not only have energy efficiency benefits, but they first and foremost put the occupant first. So certifications like WELL and FitWell and RESET are very kind of up and coming certifications that aren't energy focused like LEED or Living Building or Green Globes, but is very much focused on the health and wellness, looking at active stairwells, which also happens to help with elevator use reduction, looking at daylighting, which helps reduce lighting usage, and also looking at things like thermal comfort and indoor air quality, which is important to think about with your HVAC system and getting that right from the get-go. So making sure to balance the healthy building considerations with the energy efficiency, all while right sizing, is a very good combination.
Peter, did you want to jump back in that, or?
No, that's a great supplement to the comment.
Excellent. And so, and the other piece of it that Marta, you started to get into, and Peter, you started to talk about as well. And we have a question here on the difference between a deep energy retrofit and a conventional energy retrofit. And I'm wondering if any of you want to take that on, if, you know, Peter, Steve, Tony, or any of you.
I'll jump in and start on that. I think there are some unique differences, but the take I have at it is that if you're getting into a deep energy retrofit, it requires a bit of a holistic view of your entire building. You can't go at something like that ad hoc. If you're changing your heating or cooling system, and I'll steal Steve's thunder for a second, you need a very good building envelope to design around. You need to have that first, and then you can right size your systems accordingly. But it takes some good oversight to make sure you're doing it that way. If not, if you're going at it at a smaller approach, and maybe you're just replacing a boiler, sure, you put in an energy efficient boiler, but you may need to remain with the same capacity because you're not doing certain other things. So my approach would be, and this is the time to do it because of the cost of money, and it's less expensive than it ever has been, take a holistic view of the building before you get into any of it. Because it's amazing how you start with one thing, even if you're doing it piecemeal, but in a matter of a couple of years, you're flipping out your windows, which could have easily have led to a smaller boiler or cooling plant that someone's now oversized and probably won't operate efficiently. So think about all these things, and listen to your consultants is another good piece as well.
Yeah, I unfortunately have a very real world example of that. It's one of my favorite ones from, it was about 15 years ago. But a client came to us, they had just done a conventional boiler retrofit, like for like, but more efficient. And we're very happy with the savings. And they're like, what can we do next? And so we reclad and reinsulate and replace all the windows in the building. And now they have twice the boilers I need.
And I'm just going to change gears just a little bit, unless Peter or Marta, you have anything else to add on that, because one of the topics I wanted to make sure we got to, especially having the benefit of Tony here, is to discuss a little bit on the economic recovery and the workforce equation. And so one of the things that we talked about in our kind of pre-call when we spoke as a group before we came to think about what we want to talk about in the panel, was the dual challenge and how the increased demand for retrofits, especially with governments looking at ways to wisely spend money on infrastructure projects that will give some political buy-in to some of their mandate. How does this also address the challenge of a workforce that needs to be prepared for the jobs that are available, as we look at the number of unemployed right now, that a lot of them leaving jobs that probably won't be returning to the economy? So I'm wondering, Tony, if I could have you speak to that. Marta, you also spoke to that a bit on the pre-call, so if I could kind of get your thoughts.
That's a great question. And having been affiliated with the Canada Green Building Council and their good work on trying to look at the shortage of skilled trades across Canada and the need to enhance those, I would say that colleges and universities do a good job of training their young students and their oncoming professionals. But we need to do a much better job at doing that. There's many cases where there are enhanced skills and curriculum changes that are necessary, and that filters through a wide range of stakeholders. It's not just about what we're doing in curriculum. We need contractors to buy into that. We need trade unions to buy into that. We need policy managers who oversee the requirements for grants and funds to acknowledge that we should be doing a better job. If we're getting into a large retrofit, there has to be some criteria that have to be met to allow you to have that money. So when you're looking at a particular organization like the one I'm in or otherwise, you not only have to look at what we're doing, but we have to look at even earlier grades and skill sets in our elementary and secondary schools. We also have to look at our existing professionals and how we'll enhance their skills and their capabilities to, one, acknowledge not necessarily new technologies, but newer technologies that have actually had a long history, but that are fairly new here in Ontario. We used heat pumps and geothermal systems in our zero carbon building. It wasn't new technology, it was just newer here in Ontario. And as Steve would say, you know, having experienced that, I wish we would have done that in virtually any building I've worked on. But having said that, people who did the controls, set points and other things that they were looking at to set up the systems didn't have an understanding of that technology. They had never worked with a heat pump or geothermal system before. So there's a cascading set of requirements that many technical people need to enhance so that we can better design, better install, and better operate these buildings.
Martha, yeah.
I would say it's a real learning curve for building operators to handle these new technologies, right? A building is almost a computer these days with how sophisticated the building automation system is, how many set points and codes need to be updated and changed and addressed, all of the alerts that are popping up, and there's a real science to it and an art as well if you think about it. And so it's no longer having building operations simply kind of changing a pneumatics of you know, turning something on and off manually. It's much more sophisticated. And as building owners consider bringing in newer technology, not necessarily new, but newer, as you said, Tony, there's that risk that their building operations team don't know how to run that equipment and will struggle with that learning curve. And you know, building off of that, there's the resulting risk that the technology won't run as intended, right? It can be commissioned to the fullest extent, but then if it's not operated properly, then it loses a lot of value. So to avoid having to pay an outside firm to come in and change something every time their proprietary system needs an update, it's very critical that building operations staff get trained up on the specific equipment being installed in their buildings, but also just stay up to date on the trends of new technologies in the market writ large. And so we're seeing a lot of push for that in the market to make sure that the building operations and facility engineers are on top of those new technologies.
And I guess I'd ask, and maybe this is for Peter and Tony, is there an opportunity as we're looking at some of this, you know, stimulus money perhaps, or other investments into these retrofits or into planning for increased energy efficiency that also complements a healthier environment for some sort of partnership between, you know, places like Mohawk College or, you know, other opportunities to ensure that you're training the workforce that you're going to need to maintain the buildings that you're retrofitting and building?
I think absolutely. That's a very important part for us as an organization. That's one of our core values is learning and innovation. And something that we have learned through our experiences with working with operators is that we can't overload them with data. And I've heard what I've heard over and over again, especially from operators, is the data overload today is too much for them. And as leaders within this community, as manufacturers, designers, and educators, we really need to avoid that. We need to provide remedies, recommendations, insights for the operator to take action. And if we're going to take and hire and get new people into the space, whether it's for designing or redesigning or operating these facilities from a different background than building operations to begin with, where they're not going to know some of the challenges with the old system, we need to provide them tools that are modern, like all the other industries around us. So I think that really lands on us to make sure that we don't trap our industry in data overload, and we provide the remedies, recommendations, and insights to the operators.
Peter, that's a good point. I think one thing that facilities managers have learned over the last few years is that good companies like yours aren't just selling equipment and a product, they're selling a service. And that service goes to a broader range of skills that come to the building to help the performance of the building. So it's not just a circulating pump that our Armstrong probably has in virtually every much sector building, certainly in Ontario, maybe even Canada. But it's the understanding of and the performance of that. As we've started at Mohawk, we're getting students to do experiential learning and some research on particular products and equipment to understand the performance of these, so that as students are getting involved either on maintaining these or in many ways specifying these, they have an understanding of the product that they're dealing with. It isn't just something out of a catalog that you picked because it fits a certain curve for performance. It's about the whole product and understanding the performance of it over the long range. So that's the bigger difference, I think, today. We have good companies like Armstrong that are working with clients to help the broader perspective of how that building will perform over a period of time, and are interested in the results of that performance as well. And there's many good companies that we're working with, and the better they are informed about their product and how it works in the building, the better they'll improve them, to make them more efficient, and the facilities managers and the occupants through dashboards or otherwise will also understand better how these things work. So we're moving in the right direction, but I think as we do this and we set some higher standards and specifications, the grant monies that will come, the stimulus monies that we expect very soon, will also have to have some envelope around that, where there's an expectation of a better efficiency and an improvement in service that will help with the building owners.
So we're at our time for today, but before I let you all go, and thank you so much for the conversation, I want to give each of you the chance to kind of wind up with some final thoughts on how we manage this particular challenge of ensuring that our workforce, our students, the people that live in some of these high number, high intensity buildings, how do we keep them healthy while at the same time ensuring that we have the kind of carbon footprint that we need to have in order to remain sustainable? So just kind of some last thoughts as we go around, and not to put you on the spot, Peter, but I'm going to start with you, and then if I could have Peter, then Marta, Steve, and finishing up with Tony.
Well, certainly we're faced with a challenge in our public and private occupied spaces, addressing new concerns for our health, old concerns about our efficiency, our objectives for sustainability, but I think they all reinforce one another. It's an opportunity, as was described during the discussion, to take a holistic approach. I think there's a big role here for leadership from the government to spur this on. As a Canadian company, I know there are other Canadian companies like us who have a great history with innovation. I think there are ways to overcome these challenges and get deep retrofits achieved to improve the health of the buildings and be more green, maybe even close to net zero after a few years. But today, Armstrong is fully supportive and engaged. We've developed and launched new technologies that reduce the cost and enable us to better estimate the right sizing of projects to ensure that we get the best paybacks for customers and achieve net zero with green technologies.
Thank you, Peter. Marta.
So one thing that I do want to acknowledge is that when we think about healthy buildings and a lot of recommendations from groups like ASHRAE and others, we're seeing recommendations that tend to increase the energy usage of a building, right? If you need to upgrade your filters to MERV 13 or higher, that that's going to add static drag to your motors. And so you may need to upgrade your motors, right? There are a lot of waterfall effects here. And in order to be both pushing healthy buildings and energy efficient buildings, there's some creative strategies that can be taken into account, or even just making lemonade out of lemons, right? If you need to upgrade your motors to adjust for these higher quality filters, do it. Make them high efficiency, make that a positive for your space. And there are other ways to think about energy efficiency improvements to balance out those increased energy usage from those healthy building requirements. Thinking about tuning up your HVAC system, retro commissioning for an existing building to bring it back up to tip-top shape if it is going to be running longer. As folks re-enter buildings, if they are taking shifts or operating longer and you just have overall longer building run times, you also need to be thoughtful about maybe how sensors or other sort of technology innovations can help address that in the most optimum way possible. And then, so being thoughtful to balance the healthy features with the energy efficiency features is going to become ever more important over the next coming months.
Thank you, Marta. Steve.
I guess my final thought is sort of a riff and slightly different take of what Tony said earlier about the risks involved with all the deferred maintenance. With all our existing buildings, we're now having the risks of the sticks are coming, the legislative sticks are coming. So I happen to be on 2 steering committees, one for the City of Toronto and one for the City of Boston, both looking at legislative policies to enforce deep retrofits and carbon reductions in those cities. City of Vancouver is also going down that path, and City of New York has announced a rather large carbon tax is coming. So if you're going to manage your risk, you need to start thinking about these now, because the policies are coming.
Thank you, Steve. And lastly, Tony.
Yeah, some excellent commentary here, and it's important. I've always thought of government in many ways, besides taxes, of course, but government needs to provide good leadership. They need to give us governance, and they need to give us good policy to act on. And then what I've always asked government after that, get out of the way. Let the professionals and let the informed people in the industry use those tools to create the infrastructure that we need and do the right thing. It's been a challenge over the years. We all know of government installations, whether it's social housing, whether it's schools that need to be upgraded, whatever. We built some facilities that aren't appropriate. And given the circumstances over the last 3 months, it's given us a focus on what needs to be better. Layer that with climate change and all the things that are coming down the path related to that, it's giving us an opportunity to rethink, to do the right thing. And we're getting there. And as the infrastructure money comes out, and you layer that with all the things that Steve and others and Peter and Marta have mentioned, we're in a position to do that right thing and put the facilities in with the occupant in mind and their wellness and their healthy environment at the forefront. And so as we get that way over the next little while, we're going to create jobs, do the right things, get our buildings in shape, and we'll be better prepared for the future and hopefully avoid circumstances like we're avoiding right now.
Thank you so much to all 4 of you for joining us for this discussion. It was a great discussion. We got into, I think, a lot of real substantive meat today, so that was great. Thank you so much. There were a couple of questions that we didn't get to. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that those get written down, and all the attendees will get an email at the end of both of these sessions today, and we'll try and address some of the questions that we didn't get a chance to answer live. So with that, thank you so much. I'm just going to put a slide on the screen until 2:30 when our next panel session will begin. Again, thank you so much for joining us.